Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, we're taping this episode on February 18th, and the Super Bowl is now a memory.
Yes.
And usually around this time, aging has-been white guys like me start to feel a spring in our step as spring training approaches and baseball comes roaring back to life. But of course, that's not going to happen this year because the owners and players are again locked in mortal combat over their new collective bargaining agreement.
Right.
So I've been wondering if we should see the decades-long polarization in MLB as a kind of harbinger of the overall polarization of the United States in recent years. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, well, it's an interesting parallel to today's discussion because there's definitely, if you look at major league owners versus major league players, there's definitely a polarization between old, rich white men versus men of color, also rich. So maybe rich isn't the most useful signifier there.
Yeah.
Definitely entrenched self-interests, a lack of common cause, a difficulty communicating across the barriers. Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of meat behind this. It's a good analogy.
Yeah, and of course, it's timely also because of our topic today, and I figured it'd be a nice lead-in to today's topic, which is whether the politically polarized national situation might lead to a new civil war. So the prospect of civil war has recently become a popular topic in the media and among pollsters. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, there are actually 2 new books on this subject that are generating a lot of buzz. So I wanted you to look into this and come back with answers to 2 questions. Number 1, how likely are we to see a civil war in the near future? And number 2, what would a second civil war even look like? Because it's not going to look anything like, presumably, like the civil war that started in the 1860s.
Right.
So what did you find?
Well, thank you for the question, Joe. I can definitely say that I found that this is a very hot-button topic these days. Googling the phrase, "Is America headed for a civil war?" will bring up many, many articles from the nation's leading publications examining the question, all published within the last couple of years. And we also have the remarks of 2 serving members of Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, who conducted a Twitter poll of her followers on whether we should pursue a national divorce of red states from blue states, shortly after which she was banned from Twitter, and Madison Cawthorn of North Carolina, who said, quote, "If our election systems continue to be rigged and continue to be stolen, then it's going to lead to one place, and that's bloodshed," unquote. And then, of course, there were the incidents on January 6th of 2021, when a crowd of self-described patriots stormed the U.S. Capitol and tried to interrupt the counting of electoral votes and prevent Joe Biden from being certified as president. On the heels of that event, a January 2021 nationwide survey found that 46% of respondents found it likely that the U.S. is headed toward another civil war. Now, it's worth pointing out here right at the top that opinion polls are notoriously unreliable. They can be skewed by the number and demographics of the respondents, and also by the way the questions are posed.
Sure.
Still, all of this has people asking, are we living in the last days of the United States? And as you mentioned, there have been a couple high-profile books on the topic recently published, one of which I read for this episode, and I'll be spending a lot of time on her argument. That book is How Civil Wars Start by Barbara F. Walter. Now, Walter comes to the question with an impressive set of credentials. She served on an advisory committee to the CIA, the Political Instability Task Force, that monitors countries and evaluates the risk of civil conflict. And Walter argues in her book that researchers have developed a methodology by which we can predict which countries will slide into civil war. She says, quote, "Civil wars ignite in ways that are predictable. They follow a script," unquote. The Political Instability Task Force studied factors that might contribute to instability and found that things like political polarization, income inequality, and corruption were not as strongly correlated with instability as the nation's Polity Index score. So you're probably asking yourself, what's the Polity Index?
Yes.
That's a rating that is given to a country's political system. It's a scale from -10 to +10, with -10 being the most autocratic and +10 being the most democratic. Autocratic governments are ones that score between -10 and -6. Democracies score between 6 and 10. And in between is something called an anocracy, A-N-O-C-R-A-C-Y, anocracy, which is basically a mix of autocratic elements and democratic elements. As an example, a country like Hong Kong would be an anocracy today because it still maintains democratic elections, but increasingly the central Chinese government is deciding which candidates are allowed to run for office. The country is not fully democratic and not completely autocratic. It's somewhere in between. The Polity Index score is based on researchers' evaluation of factors such as how free and fair the elections are, whether there are restraints on executive authority, and whether the country has stable political parties. According to Walter, the evidence shows that most civil wars happen within anocracies. Healthy democracies and completely autocratic governments both have the means at their disposal to prevent political violence from escalating. Democracies do that by channeling passion for social change into political activity, while autocracies throw the leaders in prison and threaten violence against the demonstrators.
Lock her up.
Exactly. In the middle, though, democratic institutions are not very effective, and autocratic control is not absolute, and so that's where things tend to spiral out of control. According to Walter, the U.S. used to be a democracy, but now we're an anocracy. Our Polity Index score coming out of the Trump administration was a 5, which is below the threshold for democracy, and, in fact, is even lower than America's Polity Index score in the years before the actual Civil War, when we were at an 8.
Wow. So is she claiming that this is a recent phenomenon, our slippage, or was this decades in the making?
It's fairly recent. She says that our rating slipped to a large extent because of the recent trend within the federal government for the executive power to become restrained by way of executive fiat, which both Obama and Trump used to bypass recalcitrant Congress.
Yes.
Since one of the factors that the Polity Index takes into account is restraints on executive authority, that lowered our score.
Right. Okay.
I will point out here that having read the book, I'm not very confident in the objective validity of America's Polity Index score. There's a veil of scientific objectivity to the score, but it's actually based on a pretty subjective estimation of the nation's institutions. These are not numerical measurements, but rather just an estimation of how free and fair certain things are. And I'd say that this measure seems similar in some ways to the doomsday clock, which has been updated twice a year since 1947 and keeps getting closer to midnight, when we'll all die in the fires of global catastrophe, but which doesn't seem to be based on anything more scientific than the gut-level feelings of the people in charge of setting the time on the clock.
Now, the Polity Index is developed by this committee that Professor Walter sat on. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So we need to know more about who's on that committee and what their political biases are or their life experiences in order to really assess how reliable it is, right?
Yeah, and how they gather evidence, how they assess the evidence, what the process is to arrive at a score. All of that is alluded to in the book, but none of it is spelled out. So coming into this discussion today, I'm just a little uncertain about it.
Right.
And just because a measure might to some extent be subjective does not mean that it is wrong necessarily. But we should remember not to simply and uncritically take it at face value. Now, getting back to Walter's argument, she argues that civil wars tend to break out when a segment of society loses hope. And I think this is a very important point, so I'll spend a little bit of time here.
All right.
Very frequently, this is a population that, rightly or wrongly, feels like the country belongs to them, and that their country is being stolen by some undeserving group. Usually these groups are not formed along ideological lines. Instead, they self-identify along ethnic, religious, or geographical lines. And conditions, she says, are particularly dangerous if a group was in power for a long time, and only recently lost power to this other group. She says, quote, "The most powerful determinant of violence was the trajectory of a group's political status. People were especially likely to fight if they had once held power and saw it slipping away. The ethnic groups that start wars are those claiming that the country is or ought to be theirs." Unquote. At first, these groups may fight back by way of the political process and in accordance with the law, fighting for seats in parliament, for instance, or engaging in peaceful protest. And all this time, there will be extremists operating in their midst, but as long as people believe that change is possible, the extremists lack influence. It's when these measures fail them, though, that they lose hope for peaceful change, and that's when extremists have an opportunity to turn them into recruits. That's when militias form up with all these new recruits, and they start making plans for violent resistance.
Yeah, so it sounds like the thing you're describing also parallels the lead up to the Civil War in the 1860s, in that the slaveholding states enjoyed a lot of kind of disproportionate political status. And yet, as the international movement to ban slavery, end slavery, pushed inexorably toward them, they felt their political status, their trajectory ebbing, and that explains why they seceded from the Union.
Yeah, very cogent point, because that's one of the examples that she offers in her book. Abraham Lincoln was the very first American president who was elected without a single electoral vote from the southern states. So they saw this as the populous northern states pretty much getting into a position to overwhelm them, essentially.
Right.
And so it was easy for them to argue to people who might have been not convinced yet that this was a time that they needed to make a split, because from this point onwards, they would simply be out of power and out of control. So Walter argues that the U.S. is right on the brink of civil war. She points out that since 1989, the quality of life for the white working class with no college education has been declining according to almost every measure. Their income has been flat or falling, they're less likely to get married or own a home, and their life expectancy has dropped. The American dream still seems to be alive and well in places like the tech sector, where recent immigrants from places like China and India can get high-paying jobs, but it no longer exists in the nation's heartland. And this is a prescription for the loss of hope. Walter talks about racist fringe groups like the Boogaloo Boys, who think that civil war is necessary for them to get what they want, and notes the proliferation of guns in this country. I hear that last year was the very best year the gun industry in this country has ever seen.
Yep, and we mentioned that in the last episode about crime statistics, the boom in gun sales during the pandemic.
In the months before the Capitol attack, experts estimated that there were about 300 militia groups in the U.S., with a total of 15,000 to 20,000 active members, many of whom are former cops or veterans with weapons training.
And that's scary.
Yeah. So Walter presents a pretty chilling picture, and even discloses in the final chapter that she and her husband have discussed the prospect of fleeing the country if things get too dangerous.
Wow.
It's worth taking a closer look, though, at what she means when she says civil war. As you pointed out before, pretty much no one thinks that it will be a new version of the North versus the South. Walter is imagining something more like the Troubles in Northern Ireland. For those who don't know, the Irish Troubles broke out between a largely rural Catholic population in Northern Ireland that felt marginalized both politically and economically, and a Protestant population that was in control of the institutions of power, looked down on the Catholics, and also feared what they might do if they ever came back into power. In the late 1960s, Catholics engaged in protests that were mostly peaceful, but some elements in the two sides escalated to rock throwing, and when British troops were called in to keep the peace, they responded with excessive force, mostly directed at the Catholics, and people died. After that, things got bad. The two sides organized into competing paramilitary organizations that engaged in terrorism, bombings of political targets, and assassinations. The worst year of the Troubles was 1972, when 476 people died. But the conflict raged on for decades, and even today it seems like a new round of violence might be just around the corner. So when we say Second American Civil War, we're not talking about the Army of Texas marching through Arizona and New Mexico on its way to laying siege to San Francisco. Instead, we'd be looking at isolated acts of terror, bombings and assassinations targeting politicians, police, or ordinary civilians.
Yeah, but then you get into the tricky question of when does civil unrest cross the line into civil war?
Yeah.
Is there a measurement, a metric for deciding when a certain amount of violence crosses that threshold and now we're actually in a war?
Well, funny you should ask that, because as you point out, we've already seen acts like this, and America is a society in which some degree of politically motivated violence is already pretty normal.
Exactly.
But according to the academic definition, a, quote, major armed conflict is one in which there are at least 1,000 deaths per year, while a minor armed conflict is one that kills at least 25 people per year. And just let me say, it kind of blows my mind that these are not per capita figures. It feels like 25 deaths in Liechtenstein would be a lot more meaningful than 25 deaths in China, India, Russia, or the U.S.
Yes.
But there you go. These are figures that experts in the field offer up. 1,000 at the high end and 25 at the low end. And by these definitions, the U.S. was just recently in the midst of a minor armed conflict. According to the Anti-Defamation League, extremists killed 54 people in 2018, 45 in 2019, but only 17 in 2020. And we might have the pandemic to thank for that reduced figure. So thank you, COVID-19. And as an interesting historical side note, the Irish Troubles would not qualify as a major armed conflict, since that resulted in less than 500 deaths in even its worst year. But maybe that's a point where a per capita figure would be more useful.
Yes.
Now, the goal of the extremists in carrying out these attacks is to make ordinary citizens fearful, show them that their government cannot keep them safe, and force them to choose sides in the struggle on the grounds that they have no choice. It's either kill or be killed. And some critics have pointed out a fundamental irony here. In her book, Walter argues that the extremists try to create the perception that war is coming because that makes ordinary citizens more willing to take up arms. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Creating the expectation of political violence makes it more likely that the violence will happen. But Walter's own book and other arguments like it also work hard to give the sense that war is coming. And so it's a fair question. Are arguments like this irresponsibly contributing to the very same violent outcomes that they are warning us against?
Yes, and I've seen that same argument made in the press in some reviews of Barbara Walters' book, in fact.
Yeah. Fintan O'Toole, in an Atlantic article that I will link to in the sources for this episode, makes the same argument based on his personal experience growing up in Northern Ireland. One day his father came home and told him and his brothers to get ready for war because he had become convinced that an attack was imminent. O'Toole says, quote, "The belief that there was going to be a civil war in Ireland made everything worse. Once that idea takes hold, it has a force of its own. The demagogues warn that the other side is mobilizing. They are coming for us. Not only do we have to defend ourselves, but we have to deny them the advantage of making the first move. The logic of the preemptive strike sets in. Do it to them before they do it to you." The other side, of course, is thinking the same thing. Premonitions of civil war serve not as portents to be heeded, but as warrant for carnage, unquote. So we need to be very careful when we're throwing terms like civil war around, because in doing so, we could very well be making that outcome more likely. And I will say that some parts of Walter's argument appear to me to be exaggerated for effect. All of her examples of autocracies descending into civil war come from countries where democracy was a fairly recent innovation. She never seems to consider the possibility that democratic institutions, if they've been around for several generations, might not be so easy to uproot. For instance, she spends a lot of time talking about the steps Trump took to undermine democracy while in power, but then she has nothing to say about the fact that he was continually stymied by the courts, was effectively resisted at the state level, and then lost his bid for re-election by several million votes. I think it's fair to say that Walter has a tendency to cherry-pick the facts that fit her argument rather than fitting the argument to the facts.
Yeah, sounds that way.
Likewise, at one point, she states that one of the phases countries pass through on the way to civil war is when the two sides form into militias and start arming and mobilizing for war, and then states the U.S. is already in that stage, but the only evidence she offers is demonstrations like the white supremacist march in Charleston. Now, that event was outrageous and troubling, I'd agree, but I think you have to squint a bit to mistake those guys, or even the people who stormed the Capitol, for an actual functioning army. If she had argued that these are the people who might enlist in a right-wing militia later on, then I'd absolutely agree, but she seems to be trying to make a bigger point that her evidence doesn't really support.
But also, isn't it true that both sides have to be armed for this to turn into a war? I mean, right now, what I'm seeing is one side, the right-wing militias are forming, and your point is well taken about whether they're actually suited to or capable of carrying on warlike activity, but the other side is not forming militias. So how could that be the predetermining factor for a war, you know?
Yeah, Walter does cite a couple examples in her book of the other side forming militias. Like she mentions Antifa arming up, which I had personally not heard. I feel like Antifa is more of a boogeyman for Fox News. And also some Black American organizations that are arming to protect their communities. Again, not anything that I'd heard. So she seems to say that in response to a perceived right-wing threat, there are left-wing organizations that are taking up arms. But I'm not convinced there. I feel like maybe that's more hearsay than it is actual evidence. I didn't see any footnotes in support of those claims.
Yeah, well, the Black Panthers did that 55 years ago.
Yeah, 100%. So Walter creates the perception in her book that civil war is nearly inevitable unless urgent corrective action is taken. But other experts have pointed out that violent conflict is actually pretty uncommon. Most autocracies do not descend into violence. My own perception is that a lot of this current moment, when everyone seems to be asking the same question, is America headed to another civil war, is at least partly driven by the need for attention within a competitive media environment. That is to say, you don't get a book contract by reaching out to a publisher and saying that you would like to write about how civil war is probably not going to happen.
Right.
And likewise, every newspaper publisher and TV news editor knows that a provocative story draws more attention and keeps the audience tuned in. People are writing about this scary scenario because it is scary, not necessarily because they actually believe that it's likely, and certainly not because anyone can say that it's inevitable, at least not without bending the facts.
Yes, and that's why I asked you about it, for the exact same reasons you just mentioned.
So towards the end of her book, Walter does prescribe remedies that might prevent civil war, but here also I'm not entirely convinced. She says we should reinforce our democratic institutions by strengthening the Voting Rights Act and getting out the vote, which I personally am totally in favor of. But wouldn't that just reinforce the voting power of ethnically diverse urban centers, which is exactly what's alienating rural conservatives and convincing them that the political process is part of the problem? So that doesn't seem like much of a remedy. Mm-hmm. And Walter also argues that we need a better social safety net with improved public education and a higher minimum wage. And again, I'm totally on the same page with her, but I'm not sure that they would represent a solution for racist identity politics. I just don't see how the one gets to the other.
I mean, maybe if some of the aggrieved white working class people who have been getting screwed for decades, starting with the Reagan administration, maybe if they were to have jobs at a living wage, they'd be less obsessed with ridding the nation of immigration and declaring any dark-colored person to be an other who needs to be purged from the American dream, you know?
Yeah.
Just speculating here.
Yeah. One author posed an argument, and I honestly don't know where I stand on this one, so I'll just throw it out there. That arguments like this, that improved social net and raising the minimum wage as a way of getting rid of radicalization actually has it backwards. That radicalization isn't driven by economic hopelessness, but the radicalization drives the perception of hopelessness. So I think it's kind of an open question. Like, yes, if you improve education so you can think that your kids can grow up to escape poverty, and you raise the minimum wage so that people are not so worried, and you do something about the opioid drug crisis, maybe just by removing the pain and the uncertainty and the fear from people's lives, you are removing the spurs that drive them on to hating the people who live down the block from them. Or it's also possible that the hate lies earlier in the process than that, and that those things, while nice, are not going to solve the basic problem of racism, which is something which has been, part of our society as long as we've had a society.
But again, hearkening back to our last episode about crime statistics, there's measurable proof that when you improve people's material conditions, crime goes down. So it seems to me the kind of festering resentment that would manifest itself in a militia movement, doing acts of violence, a political violence on a grand scale, that would also be ratcheted down if those militia members had better material circumstances. I think the logic of the crime statistics numbers applies equally to these militia members. They will not commit their political crimes if they feel like they have a chance to make it in this world.
Yeah, I would certainly agree that it would improve things. I don't see any harm in raising the minimum wage for people who desperately need that. There's no downside from my perspective, and maybe it would help. Yeah. Walter also goes on to argue for a ban of, or at least strict oversight of, all social media. And maybe we should do a full episode on this topic because that is one gigantic can of worms.
Yeah.
It's easy to target Facebook because by now it's safe to say that everybody hates Facebook, except when we're on the mansplaining Facebook page because that's awesome. But you'd also have to take down Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, Pinterest, Nextdoor, and pretty much any other tech platform that allows people to connect, form into social groups, and message one another. So that would also apply to discussion forums and a broad array of popular video games.
Yes.
Personally, I think it's revealing that when social media is part of stories like the Arab Spring, everyone talks about it as a powerful way to unlock the voice of the people and challenge tyranny. But when it's the Boogaloo Boys using the same techniques and networks, then social media is dangerous and irresponsible, and we need to get it under control. It's worth remembering that it's pretty hard to lock down the bad without also taking out the good.
Just to add a little thing that we did actually discuss breaking up of big tech as in one of our prior episodes of Mansplaining. Number 15, folks, if you're looking for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But of course, social media is just another manifestation of big tech's tentacles.
Right. And in a country where the freedom of speech is one of our most venerated and protected liberties, I doubt it would be possible to go about systematically preventing ordinary Americans from communicating with one another except by revising the U.S. Constitution. And we already have a couple episodes touching on how difficult it is to do that.
Yeah. / impossible. At least in this current climate.
Right. But here's a bigger problem. Walter suggests no remedy for what she says is the primary driver of violence. The belief by a certain faction, in our case working-class white Americans, that this used to be their country and now it's being taken away by people who look different, act different, and in some cases have different languages, religions, and values. If this experience of loss, whether it's real or perceived, is at the heart of the problem, Walter appears to see no remedy for it. However, even if we question her ultimate conclusions, I think there's a lot of baby here that we don't want to throw out with the bathwater. It is undeniable that the white working class in this country is going through a very rough stretch. They've seen a loss of manufacturing jobs to outsourcing and automation, and the erosion of the middle class. To a very real extent, this generation has witnessed the death of the American dream. At the same time, as urban areas become more dense population centers, the democratic process threatens to leave the rural working class without a voice in our national politics. We have already seen violence as a result of this scenario, and I think it's undeniable that we'll see more going forward. I also, though, think we need to move beyond the false narrative that America was once a thriving, happy democracy, which is only now descending into violence. The reality is that this country has always been a violent place if you looked a certain way.
Yes.
Are the Boogaloo Boys any worse than the Ku Klux Klan was 100 years ago? The early history of Seattle, meanwhile, includes a shameful incident in which a community of Chinese immigrants was attacked and burned to the ground by a mob of white men who were enraged at the thought that immigrants might get jobs with good pay. I could go on and on with further examples from our nation's history. The genocide of Native Americans, lynchings in the South, the extermination of the thriving black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or the assassination of Martin Luther King. Anyone who takes a hard look at American history can find numerous acts of terrorism and political violence that our society swept under the rug and largely forgot about because they happened to target marginal groups. So maybe if you look at the full picture and consider all of America's citizens, we've never been quite as peaceful and democratic as we like to think. You could even argue that the only thing that has really changed is now, for the very first time in our nation's history, the white middle class in this country has reason to worry that political violence might come to their own doorstep, rather than being something that happens on the other side of town or the other side of the world.
Right.
And finally, I would argue that it is self-evident that creating a better situation in a greater, more stable nation means providing some means for everyone to remain hopeful. People do bad things when they run out of hope, which means that hope just might be our most valuable national resource. Even if the absence of hope does not drive a large population of Americans toward armed resistance, it might motivate them to elect a populist president who will then work to make his position permanent and enshrine minority rule in this country. That outcome seems much, much more likely to me than outright war. So today I am pledging my allegiance to hope, Joe, and to the republic for which it stands. How about you?
Boy, I would sure like to pledge my allegiance to hope. And I'm not sure where I stand on the likelihood of civil war, and I'm not sure what you said moved the needle for me in either direction. I'm still kind of casting about, trying to figure out what's likely to happen. I want to drill down on one thing that you mentioned. From my understanding, what you said about Walter's book, she does a really good job at explaining the underpinnings of how civil wars begin. And the concept of the anocracy is really interesting to me. Where I'm more confused is when she gets to what a civil war would look like in this country, which was my second question to you. She mentions the troubles in Northern Ireland, so terrorism, bombings, assassinations, presumably happening all over the country. So, what is the geography of that is one of the things I'm wondering. Is this the East and West Coast versus the South and the Midwest, which is the general blue-red divide? Or is this limited to battleground, what we think of as battleground states? Or is it metropolitan areas in every state versus non-metropolitan areas? So there's like 50 civil wars going on in the 50 states, or maybe way more than 50 civil wars. There could be civil wars going on in the blue dot in an otherwise red state, and vice versa, the red dot in a blue state. And that's the part where I don't feel like I'm hearing enough from Walter on what it would look like. Do you have any thoughts about that?
She does talk about it a little bit, not at great length. She's kind of imagining a rural versus urban divide.
Yeah.
Where the rural areas are largely dominated by right-wing groups, and so that would be, the wilderness areas would be a great place for those militias to organize and to disappear into when they need to go underground. And their targets would be symbolic objects within the cities. So we could imagine something like the Oklahoma City bombing, where a government building was taken out.
Right.
Or it could be an abortion clinic, or it could be a gay nightclub, or whatever it is that carries symbolic significance for that group and for the people that they oppose, the people that they hate.
Right.
If there's an immigrant community center, then that would be the sort of thing that a right-wing militia might target. So that's kind of what she's imagining. And also, in addition to that, because we've already seen, to some extent, that, we've seen, synagogues set on fire and that sort of thing. What she's imagining in terms of escalations is more like general purpose bombing, like maybe shopping center bombings like you read about in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And also targeted political assassinations. And
right.
She starts her book with the story of the group that was planning to abduct and murder the governor of Michigan because of her COVID restrictions.
Right.
And so she's imagining more of that sort of thing.
Right, and it sounds like in direct reaction to the prior event. In other words, synagogues have been shot up and gay nightclubs have been shot up and abortion clinics have been bombed, but there's never been a reaction to that involved bombing or killing the people who did the first act.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's what changes things from just civil unrest into civil war, when the second act is in direct reaction to the first act.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. I think in my mind, and I think Walter would more or less agree with this, you sort of shift from terrorism into civil war when it is a back and forth thing like that. Like, you can have terrorist acts if there's only one side that's committing them, but you don't really have a war until you've got two sides who are attacking each other. Like the Troubles in Ireland, there were militias on both sides of that conflict. And so you would need to have an Antifa organization that arms up and then tries to take out, meeting houses of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes, exactly.
Or throwing bombs through windows of houses that have the Confederate flag out front. Once we see that sort of thing, then
yes.
I would agree that we had passed a line in the sand.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's much. I'm glad I asked that question, because now I much better understand what it would look like. There's another thing I want to mention before we quit this topic, and that is, we talked about the two books that came out that sparked this national conversation, and you read the Walter book, and I'm glad you did. I read the other book in the 2 weeks between our last discussion and today. That book is called The Next Civil War: Dispatches from the American Future, by a Canadian journalist named Stephen Marsh. And I just want to tell you a couple of the things that Marsh says in his book. His object was not to diagnose the underpinnings the way Professor Walter did. He was just laying out a handful of scenarios for the start of a civil war in the United States that he calls dispatches. So I'll give you a quickie summary of the 5 dispatches. The first one involves a local sheriff in a western state, backed by local militias, in a standoff against the U.S. Army about whether a rural bridge should stay open or be closed. And that leads to the Army kind of violently suppressing the rebellion on the bridge. That's the first one. The second one involves a presidential assassination by the typical alienated working class loser, basically, triggering a larger cycle of violence. The third dispatch this one was chilling to my bones. New York City being devastated by a Category 2 or Category 3 hurricane that just put much of the city underwater and paralyzed all regular life in the city and had all these sweeping effects around the country and the world due to New York City being paralyzed by an act of God, which brings in the whole climate change aspect of what could trigger a civil war. Then the fourth dispatch is about a dirty bomb being exploded at the U.S. Capitol on a drone, and that triggering kind of the low-level widespread violence along the lines we were just talking about, like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, triggered by one kind of catalytic, horrific event, like a dirty bomb at the Capitol. And then the fifth one was about kind of a voluntary secession breakup of the United States, where the various polarized parties just throw it in, quit on the country, and separate that way. So very interesting scenarios he points out, and his tone is kind of unremitting doom from start to finish. Like, he thinks the United States is going to experience one of these things. So take your pick, but it's coming. Anyway, I wanted to pass that along because that's got me certainly thinking about this subject since I've been reading that book.
Yeah, I actually had heard about that tone of unremitting doom before I delved into this topic, and that was a guiding force in my choice of Walter's book to read instead, because
Yes.
I tend not to opt for unremitting doom. Like I prefer to read about things that have solutions.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. On the point of like the voluntary secession, I would imagine that that would have to be kind of like the partition of India into India and Pakistan. Because, like, if we take the example of Texas, Texas is red state. It's been a red state for a long time. It'll probably remain a red state for the time being. But something like 46% of residents voted Democratic in the last election.
Yes.
And so, as this very sizable blue population, it just, the tipping point there, it goes red. And so it's not like Texas is going to march away and all of its citizens are going to be hooray, we no longer belong to the U.S. The partition in India was much messier than that because they were splitting themselves into a Hindu state and a Muslim state. And there were a large number of Muslims that lived in the Hindu area and a large number of Hindus that lived in the Muslim area. And they were strongly encouraged to like put all their possessions into a wagon and move into their new country. And it was a traumatic event. And to a large extent, India and Pakistan are still dealing with the repercussions of that partition. So I think if Texas goes off into a glorious new red republic, there would be a lot of people who left Texas, particularly Austin, would almost completely empty out.
Yes.
And so it would not be clean at all. That would be a very, very messy division.
Right. And if we devoted as much time to Marsh's book as to Walter's, I certainly would have pointed out that what you just said is a kind of a flaw of his logic. But interestingly, since you picked that scenario, he actually publishes a map of what hypothetically the United States would split up into. I expected it to be kind of a bi-coastal sandwich, with the East Coast and the West Coast as one country enveloping the flyover country as the other country, right? But he actually is postulating 4 different countries coming from it. One of them is what you said, the Republic of Texas. Texas alone is its own republic. And then California, joined by Oregon and Washington, is the second country. And then what I just disparagingly referred to as flyover country is the third country, and the Northeast and certain northern Midwestern states are the fourth country.
So the South and the Midwest are part of the same country?
Correct. South, the Midwest, and the Mountain West, with the exception of a few northern Midwestern states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, that would be part of the Northeast grouping.
Gotcha. Yep.
Yeah.
I was wondering about Chicago specifically.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's always very interesting. We tend to think that current conditions are eternal. Of course, they never are. And the U.S. is a very large state, so there's no reason why in the future it won't break up into smaller states.
Yeah.
So I could see that happening. There is a secessionist movement that's active right now in parts of my state, where the very conservative parts of Washington, which are on the east side of the Cascades, they would like to join up with Idaho and the very conservative sections of Oregon to form a new state. And I think the conservatives who are in favor of that think, oh, goody, we'll get a new senator, like new Senate majority based on this. But what they're not really thinking through is that pretty much all of the income tax from those states come from the parts of the state that they would not be taking with them. That would be a very, very poorly funded, arid, poorly developed state. It would basically be a third world nation right in the middle of the U.S.
Right.
But I don't know, maybe they think of that as just like, a biblical desert, just an island of ideological purity.
Yeah, you actually anticipated just what I was thinking about, how the economics of this breakup is key and probably going to be the determining factor in it never happening. I think of the parable of Staten Island, which is the one borough in New York City that tilts conservative, and they always feel like they're being bullied by the rapacious liberals, and so they want to break away and form their own city. And for years they harbored this feeling that they were getting ripped off. They were giving more to New York City than they were getting back in revenue. And once the numbers were published, it turned out that Staten Island was the biggest supplicant of all the 5 boroughs. They were the takers. The rest of us were the makers, And once those stats were published, all talk of Staten Island seceding just died away instantly, because they would have been a relative third world city, had they broken away from New York.
Yeah, if you want roads without potholes and schools with teachers and books, then you kind of are relying on your cities to fund those things.
Yes. So thank you for an interesting conversation. I'm sure we're going to read a lot more about this in the press, because this idea is really all over the country now. I think a lot of people are talking about it. You have a question for me, though, for next time, Mark?
I do. So recently, my brother-in-law was giving us a hard time about Seattle's homelessness problem, which is notable. We have a number of encampments. You drive down the highway or the streets, and you see stretches of just tent after tent after tent. And so my question for you, Joe, is what is at the root of all this homelessness? And second question, what's the solution? Like, often we're told that it's just affordable housing, build housing units, and the problem will go away. I'm curious if that's actually going to be a solution to homelessness, or if it would just take, 10% off the top and we'll still be dealing with 90% of it. So those are my questions for you.
Right. Weighty questions indeed. Befits mansplaining to attack a topic like that, that's for sure. So
yes,
I will get on it and get back to you.
Look forward to it.
And now, mansplaining audience, the following message is for you. If you have any thoughts about this episode of Mansplaining, or would like to comment on this or any other episode of our podcast, please go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. It's like Cedric the Entertainer, except it's Mansplaining the Podcast. There you can like us, you can check our sources, you can leave a comment or a question about what you just heard, you can suggest topics for future episodes. We welcome and appreciate any and all feedback that you might want to share with us. And like any podcasters, Mark and I would love to grow our audience, and so the most efficient way to do that also involves you. You can give us a rating or write a review on whatever app you use to listen to this podcast. If you haven't done so yet, please do. And if you have, thank you. That's all for this episode of Mansplaining. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.